The road into Blackwater Hollow seemed to narrow the deeper he went, as if the mountains were trying to swallow him whole. Trees leaned over the dirt path like bent old men whispering warnings to anyone foolish enough to pass. By the time the surveyor reached the rusted metal sign that marked the county line, daylight had thinned into a grey, uneasy haze, the kind that made shadows look alive. Folks back in town had chuckled when he took the assignment, but their laughter had been thin, almost nervous. "Just don't go near the ridge," one of them had muttered. "And if you see a cabin with 3 chimneys, keep driving." No one explained why. No one ever did. He didn't notice the silence until he shut off the engine. No birds. No insects. Not even the distant rush of water you normally heard in these mountains. The air felt pressed flat, heavy, like breath held too long. As he stepped out, he saw footprints, 3 sets, large and deeply sunk, leading into the woods on a path that looked too deliberately cleared. The locals had warned him vaguely about the brothers up the ridge, but they never gave names. Only hushed glances and the kind of look people wear when speaking of something best left buried. It wasn't until he walked a little farther, the hair on his arms lifting for no reason he could name, that he saw it, a cabin perched between old pine trunks, half-rotten boards patched in places with scrap metal, windows blackened with soot. Yet someone had drawn back one curtain, just an inch. Only when he stared long enough did a face appear, pale, thin, framed by tangled dark hair. A woman. Her eyes wide, terrified, locked to his. She didn't speak. She didn't move. She only watched, as though silently begging him to understand something he couldn't yet see. Then, as quickly as she appeared, a rough hand reached from the shadows and yanked her away. The door creaked open a few seconds later. 3 men stepped out together, tall, broad-shouldered, their faces nearly identical, their expressions carved with the same unnatural stillness. They didn't greet him. They didn't ask why he was there. They just stared, as if assessing how difficult he'd be to drag inside. The youngest's mouth twitched into something that might have been a smile or a warning. Behind them, the cabin seemed to pulse with a dark, expectant quiet, as though it were more alive than the forest around it. Something inside him whispered to leave, to turn around before the mountains closed their jaw around him. But the brothers had already stepped closer, blocking the path, their boots sinking into the mud with slow, deliberate certainty. And as the wind finally stirred through the trees, it carried with it just one sound, the faint, muffled cry of a woman from somewhere deep within the cabin walls. The arrival of the outsider begins with an unsettling contrast, a clash between the civilized world he comes from and the untouched, brooding wilderness that waits for him in the mountains. As the county surveyor, he believes his job is simple: map the land, confirm boundaries, and return home, but the deeper he travels into the hollow, the more he feels the weight of the place pressing against him. The townspeople's strange reactions linger in his mind, the awkward pauses and the sidelong glances whenever he mentioned Blackwater Hollow. They acted as if he'd volunteered to stride into a graveyard at midnight, and though no one directly told him not to go, their warnings felt coded, as though they feared speaking openly would draw something unwanted to their doorsteps. The outsider tries to shrug it off as superstition, yet every mile farther into the ridges loosens his confidence a little more. The first signs of unease aren't dramatic, they're small, quiet things he almost dismisses. The road gradually narrows until it barely qualifies as a road at all, hedged by trees so old and tall their roots seem to pulse beneath the soil. The air grows denser, cooler, and strangely stale, carrying none of the usual scents of mountain life. No pine, no damp moss, no distant rustle of wildlife. Even the sunlight looks different here, filtered through a canopy that swallows color and gives everything a muted, grayish tint. His truck, reliable on any terrain, begins to struggle on the incline, its engine whirring louder as if protesting the journey. He tells himself he's imagining things, yet he catches himself gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual. When he finally stops at the overlook to check his map, he realizes the quiet is not natural. In any other part of the Appalachians, even the remote corners hum with life: birds calling, insects buzzing, the faint trickle of water over stone. Here, not a single sound creeps through the trees. It is the kind of silence that feels alert, aware of him. The outsider senses eyes on him long before he sees anything, and when he does catch movement between the trunks, it's only the quick flicker of a shadow, too fast and too deliberate to be an animal. His pulse picks up as he takes a step forward, scanning the trees for a shape, a figure, anything that might explain why he feels suddenly unwelcome. Despite every instinct urging him to leave, he pushes on, reminding himself he has a job to do. Yet in that moment, standing alone in a silence thick enough to choke on, he understands why the locals looked at him the way they did when he accepted the assignment. They knew something lived in these mountains, something that watched newcomers with an interest that was never friendly. The silent cabin emerges slowly from the trees, revealed piece by piece as the outsider follows the narrow, overgrown path deeper into the hollow. At first, he isn't even certain it's a home. It looks more like an abandoned structure long claimed by the woods. The boards are sun-bleached and warped, the metal patches rust-bitten, and the roof slants in a way that suggests some heavy weight once pressed down on it. But what strikes him hardest, what makes something cold slide beneath his skin, is the stillness surrounding it. A functioning homestead always has signs of life: the lowing of cattle, the shuffle of chickens, the clang of tools, the drift of smoke from a chimney. Here, there is nothing except a quiet so complete it feels deliberate, as though the very air around the place has been held hostage. He pauses at the tree line, unsure whether to call out or retreat. The clearing itself feels wrong, too cleanly cut, as if someone meticulously trimmed it to keep the forest from sealing the cabin in entirely. The grass is flattened in odd patterns, as though heavy footsteps repeatedly trace the same circles each night. A rusted bucket sits overturned beside the door, yet there are no signs of recent use, no water stains, no wet soil. Even the porch boards look dusty and untouched, though the faint impression of a boot heel marks one step, pressed deeply enough to indicate someone had stood there far longer than necessary. His gaze shifts upward, and he notices the chimneys, 3 of them, protruding awkwardly from the crooked roof. Each one is blackened with soot, but none emits even the faintest wisp of smoke. It is the middle of the cold season, and every other house he passed on the way had warm smoke curling into the sky. The absence here is not just odd, it is unnatural. He wonders if perhaps no one lives here at all, that the stories from the townspeople were nothing more than folklore meant to frighten newcomers. But the deeper part of his mind, the instinctive part, insists he is not alone. The silence grows heavier the longer he stares. He becomes aware of his own breathing, too loud in the stillness. He thinks he sees a flicker of movement behind the curtained window, but when he blinks, it's gone. The trees around the cabin seem to lean inward, like silent spectators waiting to see what he does next. He takes one careful step forward, and the ground beneath his boot seems to echo his movement, almost like a muted warning. Every sense tells him to turn back, yet some unnameable pull, curiosity, obligation, or something the mountains themselves command, draws him closer to the door. The moment he sees the woman at the window, everything he thought he understood about the cabin shifts into something far darker. It happens so quietly he almost convinces himself he imagined it. The curtain, which hangs in a stiff, soot-stained sheet, moves no more than an inch, just enough for a sliver of pale face to appear. At first, he can't make out details, only the suggestion of eyes watching him from the dim interior. He freezes where he stands, struck by the fact that she doesn't pull away when he notices her. The warnings from the town elders echo louder in his mind after the encounter at the cabin, taking on a weight he hadn't understood at the time. When he first arrived in the tiny mountain town, the people had seemed friendly enough, though their smiles never quite reached their eyes. They were polite, but not warm, a community worn thin by generations of hardship and secrets. When he mentioned the ridge, the place he'd been assigned to survey, the shift in their demeanor was subtle but undeniable. Conversations halted mid-sentence, the way a room falls silent when someone mentions a name better forgotten. A few exchanged uneasy glances. Others frowned at him as if he'd spoken something profane. One elderly man, his face weathered like dried bark, muttered that the ridge ain't meant for strangers, before shuffling away without explaining further. He tried again, approaching a woman sweeping her porch. She paused, leaning on her broom, studying him with eyes that held more sorrow than suspicion. She told him quietly that some land is better left unmeasured, that there are families in those hollows who don't welcome outsiders and haven't for longer than anyone remembers. When he pressed for details, she looked away sharply, as though afraid the mountains might be listening. Her voice dropped to barely more than a breath as she warned him not to linger near the old homesteads and, above all, not to approach the cabin with the 3 chimneys. Before he could ask why, she stepped back and closed her door, turning the lock with a trembling hand. Another elder, a gaunt man who seemed held together more by stubbornness than strength, pulled him aside later that afternoon. His eyes darted nervously, scanning the street as if expecting someone to emerge from the shadows. He said the ridge was cursed long before any of them were born, not in the supernatural sense but in the way human cruelty can poison the soil itself. He spoke of a family that kept to themselves so fiercely that even their tragedies were swallowed by the woods, leaving behind only rumors. When the outsider asked if the brothers still lived there, the old man stiffened, staring into the distance as though replaying memories he wished he could forget. He answered only with a single nod and a warning that felt more like a plea: "Whatever you see up there, keep walking. Don't go close. Don't get curious." At the time, the outsider dismissed their caution as superstition, the exaggerated folklore of an insular community. But after seeing the woman vanish from the window, the elder's words settle into his bones like cold rain, heavy and impossible to shake. Their fear had been real, raw, and carved deep from something they never dared to describe. And now, standing alone on the edge of the ridge, he begins to understand why. The brothers' pact began long before the outsider ever set foot in the hollow, long before the cabin decayed into the rotting structure it is now. Their story was whispered by those old enough to remember them as children, 3 boys born so close together in age they might as well have been carved from the same block of wood. They moved as a single unit, silent and inseparable, watching the world with an unsettling calm that made other children keep their distance. Their father, a hard and unforgiving man, kept the boys isolated from the rest of the community, dragging them deep into the woods for days at a time, returning with the same expressionless faces and a new hardness in their eyes. No one knew what he taught them, or what rituals filled those long stretches of silence between the trees, but the boys grew into men who trusted no one beyond each other. According to the fragments of stories still circulating in town, the pact was formed one bitter winter night after a tragedy that no one could quite confirm. Some said the boy's mother died mysteriously, others whispered she ran away, unable to bear the life she had been forced into. Whatever happened, the father was found hanging in the barn not long after, leaving the 3 brothers alone on the ridge, free from the rules of anyone but themselves. People claimed that in the days after his death, strange fires lit the forest, and eerie cries echoed through the hollow. By the time the smoke settled, the brothers had changed. They stopped speaking to the townsfolk altogether and began building a new life, one bound by a vow no outsider was ever meant to witness. The details of the pact varied depending on who told the story, but all versions agreed on one chilling point: the brothers swore that no outsider would ever enter their bloodline again. Whatever their father had taught them, whatever fear or obsession he had carved into their childhood, had taken root. They vowed to share everything that mattered, including whatever future their family would have. The idea horrified the townspeople, but the ridge belonged to the brothers alone, and no one dared to go up and intervene. Over the years, people noticed the brothers appearing in town less and less, their visits brief and silent, their expressions flat and guarded. When a young woman was seen on the ridge with them many years later, no one asked who she was or where she came from. Fear kept their questions buried. To the outsider, learning these fragments only amplified the dread already gnawing at him. The pact was not just a rumor or a legend, it was the operating principle of a family shaped by secrecy, isolation, and rules enforced with absolute loyalty. And now, standing within reach of their territory, he realized he had stepped into a world governed by their vow, one from which escape was never promised. The vanished midwife became one of the Hollow's most enduring ghosts, not because anyone ever found her body, but because the story of her disappearance clung to the ridge like fog that refused to lift. She had been one of the last people brave or desperate enough to make regular visits into the deeper parts of the mountains. Known for her steady hands and calm presence, she helped bring nearly every child in the surrounding counties into the world. She feared little, not the harsh winters nor the long night journeys, but even she grew uneasy when called to the ridge by a message delivered anonymously one stormy evening. Her neighbors remembered she hesitated, sensing something wrong, but duty and compassion were stronger than her fear. She left carrying her medical bag and lantern, promising to return by dawn. No one ever saw her again. What happened that night became the center of endless speculation. Some believed she reached the cabin and delivered a child whose existence was meant to remain hidden. Others whispered that she discovered something inside those walls no sane person was meant to witness. A man who lived near the foot of the ridge claimed he heard a terrible wail around midnight, a cry that rose and fell in a way that made his blood run cold, but when he went outside to look, the woods were still and empty. Another rumor said the brothers came to town a week later to buy supplies, silent as ever, but one of them carried scratches on his arms that looked like someone had fought desperately to escape. Years passed, and the forest slowly reclaimed any trace of the path she took. Her lantern was never found. Her medical bag never surfaced. Only the memory of her skill lived on, spoken with a mixture of respect and unease, as though mentioning her name too loudly might stir something on the ridge that should remain sleeping. The townspeople built their own explanation, believing she died of exposure or fell in the dark, though most knew this was a lie they told themselves to sleep at night. There had been no search party. No sheriff rode up to investigate. Everyone agreed silently that the ridge belonged to the brothers, and anyone who climbed it did so at their own peril. For the outsider, hearing her story was like having the last piece of normalcy stripped away. A woman who dedicated her life to helping others had walked into the same woods he now ventured into and never returned. The hollow was not merely strange, it was unforgiving, a place that swallowed intruders without remorse. And the knowledge that one of the last people to enter the cabin did so under the guise of aiding new life made the silence surrounding her fate even more disturbing, hinting at a truth darker than the rumors dared to say aloud. The night screams in the forest were what finally convinced the outsider that something was deeply, irreversibly wrong on the ridge. The first time he heard them, he was setting up camp near the old survey marker, close enough to the cabin to keep it in sight but far enough to feel like he had a thin buffer of safety. Darkness settled quickly in the hollow, heavier than he expected, as though the trees themselves exhaled a thick shadow that smothered any remaining light. He had grown used to the sounds of wilderness on previous assignments, the nightly chorus of insects, owls, distant coyotes. But here, the forest was mute, a silence so unnerving it felt like a living presence watching him. It was the kind of stillness that made fire crackling sound intrusive, as if he were disturbing something ancient and patient that preferred the dark undisturbed. Then, just after midnight, the silence broke. The scream began as a low, trembling wail that rose like a storm wind winding through metal pipes. It wasn't animal, not fully. Animals cried out with fear, hunger, instinct. This sound carried emotion, layered and strained, something raw and shattered. It had the ragged edge of a human voice, but twisted, as though forced through a throat no longer meant to speak. The outsider froze, the hair on his arms standing upright as every instinct inside him surged with panic. He tried to tell himself it was a bobcat or a mountain lion, but he had heard those before, and they never sounded like this. This scream vibrated with despair and agony, like someone calling out from a place no one should ever be. He grabbed his flashlight, though he wasn't sure why, whether to investigate or to defend himself, but the beam barely cut through the fog drifting between the trees. When the scream came again, closer this time, it carried a second sound beneath it, a wet, rasping gasp between each cry, as if something struggled for breath. His pulse hammered. He backed toward his truck, every step careful, terrified his movement might draw whatever was out there toward him. But the forest remained still, except for the echoes bouncing through the hollow. At one point, he thought he heard another voice layered beneath the first, higher, weaker, then abruptly cut off. By dawn, the screams stopped as suddenly as they had begun, swallowed once more by the unnatural quiet. But the outsider didn't sleep. He sat rigid in the front seat of his truck, eyes fixed on the tree line, waiting for movement. Every shadow looked like a figure. Every rustle of leaves felt like a warning. The night had peeled back the thin veil of rational explanations he'd clung to. Whatever lived on the ridge was not simply dangerous or isolated, it was suffering, trapped, or enraged. And whether it belonged to the brothers, the woman, or something else entirely, he could no longer pretend it was just the wind. The hidden grave mounds behind the cabin were not something the outsider stumbled upon accidentally, they felt as if they had been waiting for him, quietly calling his attention the moment he dared to venture behind the house. After the night of the screams, he found himself drawn to the ridge at first light, guided by a mixture of dread, curiosity, and the uneasy sense that something in the earth itself wanted to be found. The forest was still unnervingly quiet, but now that he had heard its nighttime voice, the silence felt even heavier. As he circled behind the cabin, pushing through low branches and overgrown brush, he noticed the ground begin to rise in uneven humps. At first, he assumed they were natural mounds, remnants of erosion or old tree roots hidden beneath the soil, but the more he looked, the more wrong they felt. There were too many of them, spaced too deliberately, each one a shallow swell in the earth about the length and width of a human body. Some were newer, with loose soil still dark and unsettled, while others had sunken with age, half reclaimed by moss and crawling vines. A faint, earthy smell clung to the air, damp and metallic, as if the ground itself exhaled decay. Kneeling beside one of the youngest mounds, he pressed his hand to the soil, and though he told himself it was only the morning chill, a coldness radiated upward that made his skin crawl. He noticed something else then, a piece of torn cloth sticking out from the edge of one mound, half buried in dirt. When he tugged it free, it revealed itself as a scrap of fabric, frayed and stained, too fine to be the rough clothing worn by the brothers. It reminded him of something else entirely, the type of cloth a midwife might carry, or a woman kept hidden away. He rose slowly, the realization settling heavy in his chest. There were far more mounds than there should ever be near a place inhabited by only 3 men and 1 woman. No one in town had mentioned deaths on the ridge, no funerals, no missing relatives except the midwife, yet there were at least a dozen graves here, perhaps more hidden beneath the undergrowth. Each mound felt like a sealed secret, a quiet burial of someone whose story had been erased before it ever reached town. He scanned the clearing, suddenly aware of how exposed he was, how the brothers could be watching from any window or tree line. The forest seemed to draw closer, the shadows thickening as if reacting to his discovery. He stepped back carefully, his breath catching as a breeze stirred the trees. It whispered through the clearing in a way that almost resembled voices, faint and mournful, as though the buried dead were trying to speak through the rustling leaves. The outsider felt the weight of their silence pressing against him, warning him, pleading with him, reminding him that those who entered the ridge rarely left without leaving some part of themselves behind. The woman's message came in a way the outsider could not have anticipated, small and fragile but carrying the weight of everything the hollow had hidden for generations. He had spent days circling the cabin, observing from a distance, careful not to draw attention to himself, and the forest seemed to shift around him with each passing hour. The air grew heavier, and the silence more oppressive, pressing against his thoughts until every creak of a branch or rustle of leaves felt amplified, warning him that he was not welcome. It was during one of these cautious excursions, as dusk fell and the last light bled weakly through the treetops, that he noticed something tucked among the roots of a twisted oak, just a few paces from the path he had been following. At first, he thought it was a scrap of bark, a piece of trash carried by the wind, but as he knelt, he realized it was a torn piece of burlap, roughly shaped and scorched along one edge. The markings on it were crude, written in a substance that smelled faintly of ash and dirt. He picked it up carefully, turning it in his hands. The message was brief, jagged, desperate. "They won't let me leave. Don't let them take you too." The words seemed to vibrate with urgency, as if the woman herself had pressed her fear and energy into the fibers. His pulse quickened. He had seen her before, briefly, at the window of the cabin, her eyes wide with silent terror, and now he understood that glimpse had not been a warning, it had been a call for help. The note confirmed what he had feared but could not fully comprehend. She was trapped, held against her will in a household that obeyed rules older and darker than anything in the surrounding valleys. The brothers' control was not limited to the cabin, it radiated outward, a shadow in every tree and rock, binding the land itself. He looked around, suddenly hyper-aware of how exposed he was, how the forest seemed to close in with a quiet insistence. The message made the invisible barriers of the hollow tangible. Whoever the brothers were, they ruled not just through presence but through a carefully maintained fear that reached far beyond the walls of the cabin. He realized that the woman's warning was as much about survival as it was about guidance. She was signaling him to proceed with caution, to recognize the stakes, to understand that the ridge had already claimed those who underestimated it. The fabric slipped from his fingers, almost as if it were trying to escape back into the earth, leaving him with the sense that the message had arrived just in time, that she had known he might come too close, that the forest itself had conspired to deliver her plea before it was too late. The outsider felt the full weight of her words, a chilling confirmation that the story of the ridge was not mere rumor or superstition, but a living, breathing reality that could not be ignored. Every instinct urged him to leave, but the note had ignited a different awareness. Whatever he chose to do now, he was entangled in something far larger, darker, and more inescapable than he had imagined. The revelation of the brothers' regime came gradually, like a slow, suffocating fog rolling down the hollow, but when the outsider finally understood it, the weight of it pressed down on him with unbearable force. It was not a single moment, not a sudden uncovering, but a series of signs and glimpses that pieced together into a horrifying picture. The cabin, already ominous in its decay, was only the surface. Every detail he had noticed, the stillness of the forest, the unlit chimneys, the strange arrangement of paths, the hidden mounds, made sense now as parts of a system meticulously maintained over decades. The brothers' world was one in which control was absolute, and everything within their reach bent to their will. Their rules were unwritten but enforced with a severity that transcended explanation. Outsiders were rare, and any who approached too closely either vanished or left permanently changed. The woman at the window, the midwife who had disappeared, the cries in the night, all were evidence of a family that ruled through isolation, fear, and absolute obedience. The outsider began to see the patterns in the land itself. Paths were deliberately obscured or cleared only in certain directions, guiding movement and limiting choice. The mounds behind the cabin were not random, they were markers, a silent record of lives subsumed into the family's hidden order. Inside, though he never entered, the occasional glimpses of movement suggested rituals and interactions governed by a code that was terrifyingly consistent. The woman's presence was controlled, her freedom stripped in ways that were subtle to anyone untrained to notice but devastatingly complete to anyone paying attention. The brothers had created a microcosm of themselves, a closed system where they dictated relationships, life, and death, and where any deviation from their rules was punished silently, thoroughly, and without witnesses. The forest surrounding the ridge amplified their control. Its oppressive quiet, the unnatural stillness at night, and the way the trees seemed to lean toward the cabin created an environment that reinforced their dominance. The outsider could feel it, a psychic pressure that slowed his thoughts and made him hyper-aware of his own vulnerability. The women, children, and men within the regime, if any survived fully, were trapped not just by the physical barriers of the cabin and surrounding forest, but by a cultivated fear that had grown over generations. Their autonomy had been gradually eroded, replaced by compliance dictated by the three brothers' singular authority. As the outsider pieced together the evidence, he realized he was witnessing the product of decades of secrecy, isolation, and obsessive control. This was more than a family's eccentricity or reclusive behavior, it was a structured, functioning regime, maintained with precision, ruthlessness, and a chilling logic. Every scream, every vanished person, every hidden grave fit into this terrifying system. He now understood that the brothers' power was absolute within the hollow. Their reach extended beyond what the eye could see, and the consequences of trespassing were immediate, invisible, and final. The truth of the hollow was not something one could confront lightly, for it was a living structure of dominance, fear, and inescapable control, and anyone who entered its boundaries became part of its story, whether they realized it or not.